예수를 믿는 유대인들을 메시아닉주라고 하죠. 이스라엘에서 아마 메시아닉주 공동체로서는 가장 큰 공동체가 아닌가 싶고요. 또 그 공동체에서 발행하는 리포트가 있습니다. 마오즈 이스라엘이라고 해서 이스라엘에서 일어나는 여러 가지 일들을 메시아닉주의 입장에서 설명을 하고 또 전 세계 사람들에게 기도 요청을 하는 그 리포트가 바로 마오즈 이스라엘, 마오즈 리포트인데, 저희 브리드 TV에서도 그 마오즈 리포트를 한국어로 번역해서 여러분들께 제공해 드리고 있죠. 그 마오즈 리포트를 발행하는 마오즈 이스라엘이라고 하는 선교회가 있습니다. 그 마오즈 이스라엘 선교회의 미국 지사입니다. 마오즈 이스라엘 USA 지사 대표이신 테드 씨를 오늘 만나러 이곳에 왔습니다. 이렇게 시간 내주셔서 고맙습니다.
Hello.
우선 마오즈 이스라엘, 한국 분들에게 좀 어떤 선교인지 좀 소개를 해주시겠습니까?
Maoz Israel Ministries is a Messianic Jewish ministry based out of Tel Aviv, Israel. We've been ministering in the land since 1976, and we have a number of main functions that we do. One of them is humanitarian aid. We take care of persecuted Jewish and Arab believers in the land of Israel. We help victims of terrorism, orphans, widows, and the needy believers. We assist them through our humanitarian aid. We also do outreach and evangelism. We have a congregation that we started in Tel Aviv called Tiferet Yeshua, which means the glory of Jesus in Hebrew. And we're the only Messianic or Christian publisher in Israel. We translate 3 to 4 books a year into Hebrew and sometimes into Arabic. And those are sown into about 200 congregations across the land. We also do a lot of media outreach. We produce videos. We have a channel in Israel called viewthis.com, where we have the testimonies of Jewish believers and dynamic worship music videos and just other media type resources for the Israelis in the land. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we do.
그러면 마오즈 이스라엘의 미국 지사에서는 어떤 일을 하고 있습니까?
The U.S. office is the main office for Maoz Israel Ministries. We handle most of the administrative functions for Maoz Israel, including the finances, the administrative, all of the incoming mail for the United States. But we function as kind of a covering for all of the international offices. We do have offices in Canada, Germany, England, Ireland, also in Israel. But most of the administrative tasks come out of this office. Plus, out of this office, we speak to churches and Messianic congregations around the United States and inform them what Maoz Israel is doing in Israel.
저 마오즈 이스라엘 사이트를 자주 들어가요. 거기 들어가서 보면은 마오즈 리포트도 매달 이렇게 올라오고, 또 요즘은 뉴스 프로그램을 아예 직접 제작을 하시더라고요. 어떻게 해서 그런 일들을 하시게 됐습니까?
Well, the idea for the Israel Frontline show was really started with Sid Roth and its supernatural ministry, which is a television ministry here in the United States. And Sid Roth is a Messianic Jewish believer and a friend of Ari and Shira. And the Lord really laid it on Sid's heart to start a show that would bring news and information from a Messianic perspective from Messianic believers in the land of Israel. And so that was the genesis of the idea. And he approached Shira and said, this is kind of what I'm thinking. Would you be interested? And Ari and Shira spent some time praying about it, and they felt like the Lord wanted them to do this, and that was the beginning of it. And so far, it's been pretty amazing. Some pretty amazing fruit that's come from it.
이 미디어 쪽이라는 것이 나름대로 전문적인 기술이 있어야 되거든요. 뭐 스튜디오도 만들어야 되고 또 촬영과 편집과 또 송출하는 것까지. 이스라엘의 그 예수 믿는 빌리버들의 숫자가 많지 않은데 그런 일을 할 만한 인력을 찾아내기가 쉽지 않았을 것 같아요.
That has been really, I would say, first and foremost, a blessing of the Lord upon the efforts, because the resources and the equipment that we have to work with have been limited. But ultimately, I would say first and foremost, it's been the blessing of the Lord. But we've been investing over the last few years in upgrading our equipment and putting that out there to the believing community worldwide. And it's not just the equipment, but even trained people who were able to work in that kind of a production. And so it's really been a small miracle that we've been able to pull this together on such short notice and put together a production to that level.
자, 이제 그러면 개인적으로 테드 씨에 대한 궁금증을 좀 여쭤보겠습니다. 어떻게 해서 테드 씨는 이 마오즈 이스라엘과 연결이 되어서 이런 사역을 같이 하시게 됐습니까?
My parents were Jewish. My father was completely Jewish. My mother was part Jewish, part Irish. But at age 5, I was adopted into a Gentile family. And so I wasn't raised in a Jewish home from age 5 on. But after I became a believer in 1989, the Lord started to connect me up with Jewish people and Messianic Jewish people almost immediately after I became a believer, and in October of 1989. And off and on, I had served in different ministry capacities. I was an associate pastor in Ohio. I did prison ministry, and I did a couple outreaches with Jews for Jesus. But I was in the military for 25 years in the Air Force. And even in my military career, God had been connecting me up with Jewish people and Jewish believers along the way. We got stationed in the Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area about 4 years ago. About a year after we got stationed here in Texas, we had visited a congregation for the first time, and I had an encounter with the Lord. Felt like the Lord said to me, "Get out of the military, Israel's your destiny." I told my wife, I said, I feel like I've heard from the Lord, and I feel like the Lord wants me to get out of the military because Israel's my destiny. And she said, and do what? And I said, well, I don't know. I just feel like the Lord said, go. And so we prayed about it for about 3 days. And after about 3 days, I submitted my separation paperwork from the military. I had to finish up my commitment with the military, which was about 11 months. Immediately after I submitted the paperwork to separate from the military, a series of what I would call supernatural connections began to unfold. The first was my wife had went to a hair salon to get her hair short because she was going to be going to Israel in a few months. My daughter was on a 6-month mission trip to Israel and staying with some very good friends of ours who live outside Jerusalem. And she walked into the hair salon, and the hairstylist asked my wife how she wanted her hair done. And she said, I want to get it short so by the time I go to Israel, it'll be about the same length. The ladies in the hair salon all stopped what they were doing. And one lady came across the hair salon and asked my wife, what did you just say? And she said, I want to get it short so when I go to Israel, it'll be about the same length. And she was a believer, and she turned and looked at all the other hairstylists and said, you see? Well, this hair salon had been failing. They were going to close because they didn't have enough business coming in. And the day before, this lady who was a believer in Yeshua, in Jesus, had gotten all the stylists to take up an offering, and they sewed it into Israel. And the next day, the first person to walk in was my wife, and she's first words off of her mouth were Israel. And so my wife said, we really need to meet this lady. And that was a Thursday. The following Monday, we were on our way to have breakfast with some friends from our congregation. And we got texted by this lady, and she said, can we meet at a restaurant called Panera Bread? And my wife said, well, you go to Panera, which was right across the parking lot from the restaurant we were heading to meet our friends from our congregation. And she said, you go to Panera and I'll go to the other restaurant and tell our friends we're not coming because we're going to meet this lady. I'm standing in line. I just finished ordering my food, and a gentleman walks in behind me, and he puts his hand on my shoulder from behind, and he says, excuse me, do you speak Hebrew? And then I turned around and I thought maybe I had met the man before. And I'm thinking, how would he know that I was learning Hebrew. We talked for a moment, and I went and sat down, waiting for my wife to come. And he got his food, and he came over to my table, and he said, "Can I sit with you?" And I said, "Sure, I guess." And he says, "You don't know me, but my name's Philip." And he goes, "I'm with a ministry in Israel." And he goes, "I'm here for a meeting with a ministry called Josh McDowell Ministries and Mercy Ships." And he goes, "I saw you and I felt like you had something to do with Israel. Do you have something to do with Israel?" And I said, "Well, my daughter's on a mission trip and I just submitted my separation paperwork to get out of the military because I feel God's calling me to go to Israel." And he goes, "I knew it." He goes, "I feel like God wants me to connect you with some people involved in ministry in Israel." About that time, my wife called and said, "Come over to the other restaurant. I want this lady from the hair salon to meet our friends from our congregation." And I said, "Well, I'm here with this guy, Philip." And she says, "Okay, well, you stay there." So the next thing you know, my friends from our congregation come over and this lady that we were going to meet. Well, Philip goes out to his car and gets some newsletters from his ministry, comes back in, and he's passing them out to everybody. And the lady from the hair salon opens up and starts looking at his newsletter, and she goes, "Are you from such and such ministry?" And he goes, "Yeah, I'm the international director." And she looked at us and she said, "This is the ministry that we had sown all of our money into just a few days before." And so the next day, we exchanged information. Philip calls me and he said, "I have these two names for you. One is a guy named Kalev Myers in Israel, who has a ministry called Jerusalem Institute of Justice, and a guy here in Texas named Kevin Bentley, who has a ministry called Johnson County for Israel." And I had never heard of either one of them. So I started looking them up online. And about that time, I got a call from my daughter who was on her mission trip in Israel. And I told her this whole story. And we ended our phone call, and she called me back about 45 minutes later from Israel. And she said, "Dad, what was the name of the guy here in Israel that he told you?" And I said, "Kalev Myers." And she goes, "I made dinner for him and his wife last week," because the name sounded familiar, and this is the couple that I made dinner for last week. Additionally, my daughter Amanda was a vet tech, a veterinarian here in the States, and when she was over there, one of the people in Kyman Riddy's congregation who was a believer had lost some employees, so Amanda volunteered at this vet clinic. Well, this turned out to be Kalev's brother-in-law. And so I began to see that the Lord might be doing something here. Well, then I met with Kevin Bentley from Johnson County for Israel here in Texas. And we met at a restaurant called Chick-fil-A here. And we had an amazing meeting. And at the end of the meeting, Kevin said, "We're going to have a night for Israel where we're going to bring all these ministries from Israel together to bless them, and we're going to have all the leaders from these ministries." And he goes, "Not only do I want you to come, but I feel like I'm supposed to have you open it." And which made me a little bit nervous, but I said yes, and this was going to be a couple months away. In the meantime, people continued to come up to me, whether we were at a Starbucks or out to eat, or shopping at the grocery store. People were coming up. "Are you Jewish? Do you speak Hebrew? Do you have anything to do with Israel?" We were out on our anniversary date, and a man in town from Norway comes up, and he says, "I've never done anything like this before," but he goes, "I just have to ask you." And he goes, "Do you have anything to do with Israel?" And this was about the 12th time this had happened. So my wife and I just kind of looked at each other and laughed and said, "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, we do." And this man from Norway, whose name was Tagi, got down on his knees, and in the middle of our anniversary date, with everybody watching, prayed a blessing over us and our calling to Israel. And this continued for several months. Well, then the Johnson County for Israel event was coming up, but the week before that, I had to go down to San Antonio, Texas for my out processing from the military. I had a briefing I had to attend, and I took my family down there with me because that's where I went through basic training when I came into the military. And on the way back, it was a Friday night, and we were invited to come to hear a guest speaker at a church. And we got to the church. It was about 40 minutes into the service. And when we opened up the sanctuary doors, the guy stopped the service. And he said, I see labor and delivery room across the back of the sanctuary wall. And he goes, I feel like somebody's about to be born into their calling. Just about 3 weeks prior to that, we were at a prayer group for Israel, and a lady that we did not know came up and had put her hands on my wife's belly and said, you're pregnant, but not with a baby, with a calling. And she said, just like a baby has a defined conception point, and 9 months later the baby comes, she goes, this is the year that you guys are going to be born into your calling. The next night was the Johnson County for Israel event. That night, I get there to the event, and I met Ari, Avi Mizraki from Dugit, Bridges for Peace was there, Jonathan Burness, many ministries focused on Israel. Well, one of the ministries, Jonathan Burness, had a little card on the table. It said that they were looking for a computer IT person, and that's what I did in the military. And I picked it up, and I set it back down, because I really didn't want to work on computers again. And my wife said, pick that back up. That might be the thing that God has for us. And so about 3 days later, we decided to put together a testimony and a short little resume for this, just to see. I didn't really feel like the Lord was on this particularly, but we decided to go on and see if that was the door. So my wife was helping me put together my testimony and my resume. About 10:30 at night, she decided to go to bed, and I was finishing up. About 11:15, I was getting ready to hit send on the email to Jonathan Burness's ministry, and the den door opens. And my wife says, did you send it? And I said, no, I'm getting ready to send it now. And she says, I feel like God says, no, don't send it. She said, I feel like if you send it, you're going to get it, but that's not the place that God wants you to be, Phoenix. And so I was like, well, I wish God would have told us that 3 hours ago before we started this big process. So the next week, I'm invited to do a Christ, a Messiah, and the Passover presentation in Mansfield, Texas. And at the end of the presentation, a lady comes up and she goes, I know you don't know me, but she goes, I heard you speak this past fall on the fall feasts. And she goes, and since then I've felt like the Lord has put this on my heart to tell you, and now that I've see you again, I just feel like I have to tell you this. She goes, I feel like God wants you to send a testimony and a resume to Maoz Israel Ministries because He has a position for you there. She didn't know that I had been at this event just about 2 weeks prior, where I had met Ari and many other ministries. She didn't know that I had picked up this card from Jonathan Burness's ministry and went through this exercise to make a testimony and a resume for that. And she says this to me. So I go to Maoz, which I was familiar with, and looked at their page, and I didn't see that they had any positions, but I went ahead and sent my testimony and my resume to their general info email. And about 6 weeks later, I got up and I was feeling kind of anxious because nothing had come through, and I'm down to my last military paycheck, and I have a large family, 6 kids, and I didn't know what God had next. And I told my wife, I said, I feel kind of nervous and anxious. Maybe I didn't really hear from the Lord. And she said, well, we need to worship and pray. And she said, gather all the children up and hook your computer up to our little amp, and we're going to play worship music, and then we're going to pray. So we worshiped as a family, and then we prayed. And as we were praying, I was going to be the last one to pray. I remember somebody earlier in the year had come up to me and said these words to me, and I wrote it in my journal. And it was, you're no longer to toil in things of no eternal consequence, but your hands have been set apart for a holy occupation. And I remembered that word, and it came to be my turn to pray. And I said, all right, Lord, I give my hands to Yeshua. Whatever you want to do with them, I give them to you. We dropped hands, and my email doinged really loud because it was still hooked up to the amp from when we were playing worship music through my computer. And I went over, and it was an email from Maoz Israel Ministries. And the email said, we would like to meet you next week. And I didn't know that their U.S. offices were right here in the Dallas area where we were living. So the next week we get to a little restaurant in Arlington called Mimi's Cafe. I have an app on my phone that lets me know whenever there's anything significant about Israel. It pops up a little reminder, and my phone flashes Jerusalem Day. It's Jerusalem Day. That is the day of my interview. And this couple walks in to interview me and my wife. They told me to bring my wife along. And so they asked us how we got this heart for Israel. And my wife led off talking about how she had grown up with Chaim Singerman and Rudy, and Chaim had been a big force in her coming to know the Lord almost 27 years ago now. And that how our daughter had been over there on a mission trip. And this couple stopped us in the interview, Ray and Christy Wilkerson, and they said, Chaim and Rudy Singerman of Abu Ghosh, Israel? And she said, yeah. This couple was mentoring Chaim and Rudy 27 years ago. They were discipling them at the very time that Chaim and Rudy was witnessing to my wife over the phone, because my wife lived in Ohio, Chaim and Rudy were living here in Texas. And so here we are interviewing before this couple who was really kind of indirectly responsible for my wife's salvation. After that meeting, we were still waiting to hear if Maoz was going to bring us on board. I felt like the Lord wanted me to share with the leader of my congregation this whole story about the very first weekend when I came there, and I heard the Lord say, get out of the military, Israel's your destiny. And so I asked him, I said, Steve, can you meet? I have a testimony to share with you. And he said, sure, let's meet at the Panera Bread restaurant. I got there about an hour before him later on in the week, and I felt like I heard from the Lord again, just like I had that weekend many, many months ago, where the Lord said, get out of the military, Israel's your destiny. But this time I felt like the Lord said, don't just tell him about the last year and a half since you've been in his congregation. Tell him about your adoption, how you came in the military. Tell him about how you became a believer in a little Baptist church. You were born again in this little Baptist church in Ohio, and that's how your call to Israel was born in that church. Tell him about your time in Iraq and how that was connected with your first trip to Israel. And I sat there thinking, Lord, why do you want me to tell him all of this? But I just couldn't escape the feeling that the Lord wanted me to tell him. So I started telling him about my adoption, how I came into the military, how I was born again in this little Baptist church in Fairborn, Ohio in 1989, and that's where my call to Israel was born. And he stops me and he said, did you say First Baptist Church of Fairborn, which is 1,200 miles from here? And he said, I was physically born in that church. He goes, my dad pastored that church many years ago for 2 years before he came down to Southwestern Seminary. So here I was coming into the fullness of my call to Israel in a congregation pastored by a man who was born physically where I was born spiritually, and my call to Israel was born 25 years ago. About a week later, I put out a fleece before the Lord. I said, Lord, if this is your will, I want to know by noon on Shavuot, Pentecost. At 11:59 on Shavuot, Pentecost, I got the call from Christy saying, we want you to come on board with Maoz. We had been praying and we felt like we needed a spokesman in the United States for Maoz, and that's about the time my testimony and my resume came in, as they were thinking about that. And I've been with Maoz since June of 2013, and so coming up on 2 years, and it's been amazing.
미국에서 이스라엘에서 이 사역하는 일이 어려움도 많을 것 같아요. 어떻습니까?
No, I don't. I feel like it's been a big part of my destiny, and God has been confirming that all along the way. In 2003, after I got back from my second deployment after 9/11, God opened up the door for me to work in the White House under President Bush. And the way that came about was so rapid. I didn't apply for it. I didn't interview for it, and my clearance to work there came in 2 weeks, and I found myself there in 2 weeks later, and I felt like the Lord had me there to intercede for Israel the whole time that I was there, and my last night there was Yom Kippur of 2004, and after I came on board with Maoz last year, I met with a guy who's a White House correspondent who wrote a book called Eye to Eye. His name's Bill Koenig, and it was talking about the consequences of nations who try to divide the land of Israel. And I found out that he was there carrying that message when I was there praying and interceding, carrying that message in prayer. He was carrying that to leadership. And so I've come to Maoz, and I think it's destiny, God's destiny on my life. And to be honest with you, there's been spiritual warfare involved with it. Crazy things happen. You know, we're carrying this heart for Israel to the church, but along the way there's spiritual warfare that goes along with it. A few weeks ago I was almost run over. Yesterday I had a flat tire on the way to a meeting, and little things like that happen. And sometimes churches don't understand why Israel matters, but I really feel like that is the core message that we're to carry now in this hour, is why Israel matters, because Israel and the spiritual restoration of Israel is the key to worldwide evangelism. It is the key to the fullness of the Great Commission that Yeshua gave us. Revival and awakening are connected to that, and so it's amazing to be a part of that.
이 방송을 보시는 한국 크리스천들에게 우리 마오즈 이스라엘 위해서 이렇게 기도해 주십시오. 기도 제목 있으면 알려주시기 바랍니다.
Definitely, we need prayer. We need the body of Messiah to stand with the Messianic community in Israel, because there's a lot of persecution. The Middle East is a difficult place to live because of the constant threat of conflict. We had this war this past summer, and some of our staff members had very close experiences with the rockets that were being launched from the Gaza Strip. Over 4,000 rockets in 50 days. And so pray for the believers in Israel to be strengthened, to be refreshed, to be encouraged. You know, they've been laboring hard, tilling the field, believing that God will bring revival and a great awakening, and that they would begin to see that fruit.
오늘 이렇게 귀한 시간 내주시고 개인의 솔직한 신앙 간증까지도 이렇게 들려주셔서 너무 고맙습니다. 오늘 시간 내주셔서 고맙습니다. 감사합니다.